For decades, the American middle class was presented to the world as the backbone of an unbeatable nation, a symbol of stability, progress, and reward for effort. But slowly, that image began to crack. Not with scandals or big announcements, but with a silent erosion that spread through millions of homes. Today, workers who always believed in merit are discovering that working harder doesn't mean living better. Their wages seem to shrink as the cost of everything rises, and the prevailing feeling is that something invisible is draining their energy, their income, and their hope, a little more each month. In cities, in suburbs, in supermarket aisles, and at dinner tables, the disparity is the same. Shelves full, but shopping carts empty, streets lit but homes drowning in debt, families hyper-connected but emotionally exhausted. The promise of the American dream, which for decades served as a compass, now seems an increasingly distant horizon, accessible only to a segment that continues to prosper, while the rest struggle to avoid regression. This contrast between discourse and reality is revealed in details that many try to ignore. The never-ending financing, the bills that arrive before payday, the feeling of running without getting anywhere. It's as if the country has silently changed the rules, and no one has warned the middle class. And it is precisely here that the question that initiates this investigation arises. How could such a celebrated model become so fragile so quickly, and without most people even noticing? Because behind this erosion lies a pattern, a set of silent mechanisms that reshape the destiny of millions. In this video, I'll reveal exactly where it all began. Before we move on to the next chapter, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. This ensures you can follow each step of this investigation and helps us keep this work going. Let's continue. What once seemed like an isolated discomfort is now revealing itself as a national phenomenon, perceptible not only in statistics but also in everyday details that reveal a profound shift in the American social structure. As smaller cities lose residents at an accelerated pace and large urban centers become economically inaccessible, a fragmented landscape emerges, marked by silent neighborhoods, shops closing without warning, and residences that remain empty for long periods, even those located in areas that historically symbolized prosperity. This emptying does not occur abruptly, but through a slow and continuous erosion, driven by costs that rise faster than any wage increase, creating a mismatch that transforms even the hardest working people into financial survivors. Families who once could plan vacations, save for emergencies, or invest in the future, now face decisions that would have seemed unthinkable before, such as choosing between paying rent or buying food, postponing medical care, or resorting to multiple jobs just to maintain a basic standard of living. The phenomenon of modern ghost towns is not restricted to distant rural areas. It manifests itself in dense suburbs, where properties remain immaculate on the outside, but hide indebted, emotionally exhausted residents, fearful of losing what little they still possess. This collective feeling of precariousness, amplified by economic instability, fuels a climate of insecurity that spreads silently, reinforcing the perception that something structural is deteriorating. Even with well-stocked shelves and official figures attempting to show stability, the reality experienced by millions reveals a different narrative, an economy that seems to work only for those already at the top of the pyramid. This discrepancy between appearances and real experience generates a feeling of powerlessness, especially among those trapped in a cycle of excessive work and minimal return, as if each advance were immediately nullified by a new cost increase or an unexpected expense. And while this pattern repeats itself on a national scale, the question that inevitably arises is, if the symptom has become so visible, what exactly is hidden behind this silent deterioration? And to what extent does this invisible cause shape the destiny of an entire social class? When the first symptoms are no longer ignored, it becomes impossible to avoid the central question: what is really behind the silent collapse of the American middle class? The apparent disorder does not stem from individual decisions, but from structural mechanisms introduced over decades, normalized to the point of seeming inevitable. These mechanisms function like invisible threads that keep workers trapped in a rigid system designed to increase corporate profits while reducing, year after year, the capacity for social mobility. The first of these elements is the culture of debt, which transforms education, health, and housing into long-term financial commitments. Credit cards, loans, and financing are sold as opportunities but operate like chains that accompany citizens from youth to retirement. The second mechanism appears in the model of continuous consumption, encouraged by advertising and social pressure, creating a cycle that demands more work to sustain a lifestyle that never stabilizes. The third mistake is the inherited belief that effort guarantees growth, when in practice, the current system only rewards those who operate on a corporate scale. Complex taxes, flexible policies, and benefits geared towards the top form the fourth mechanism, draining resources from the economic base. The fifth arises as a consequence, the illusion that everything still works, keeping millions trapped in a model that no longer fulfills its promises. When these elements combine, they reveal a structural trap, and the real impact begins to become impossible to hide. Which of these mistakes do you think most affects the middle class? Comment below. When these 5 mistakes cease to operate silently and begin to appear in families' daily lives, the problem reveals its true dimension. It doesn't arise from a single event, but from continuous wear and tear that intensifies year after year. The initial impact manifests as financial instability. More and more people need multiple sources of income just to maintain the basics, while the feeling that nothing is enough settles in even among workers with stable jobs. Small businesses, which once supported entire communities, lose strength. Neighbors stop supporting each other as before, and the future begins to be planned not by hope, but by the fear of the next bill. The deterioration also affects the social fabric. Cities that were once characterized by conviviality and community rhythm now face population decline, reduced circulation of money, and increasing dependence on welfare programs. Schools close, hospitals operate at their limit, and public services shrink, leaving neighborhoods silent and emotionally fragmented. Meanwhile, the psychological impact becomes inevitable. Families who do everything right live with a sense of failure, while young adults postpone their own projects because they cannot free themselves from the inherited financial burden. Anxiety becomes constant, and polarization grows as everyone looks for visible culprits for causes that, in practice, are structural. Given this scenario, the question that redefines the entire investigation arises: if the present is already so fragile, what will happen when the still unseen effects finally come to light? As the economic and social consequences deepen, it becomes evident that the quietest and perhaps most devastating impact lies not only in the accumulated bills or the cities losing life, but in the subjective transformation of a country that is gradually losing its capacity to feel. The routine of millions of people has become a repetitive sequence of overwork, long commutes, financial commitments, and desperate attempts to meet a standard of living that is no longer sustainable with available income. This process, although widely normalized, produces an emotional exhaustion that corrodes every aspect of daily existence, creating a population that lives more on autopilot than in any form of full awareness. Within this scenario, technology, once heralded as the great facilitator of connection, ends up intensifying the feeling of isolation. Devices are always on, notifications appear every minute, and social networks simulate bonds that do not replace the growing absence of real community. Entire homes, even those equipped with modern comforts, remain in profound silence for most of the day, while residents limit themselves to superficial or functional interactions, unable to dedicate time to relationships not directly linked to the effort of surviving financially. The promise of freedom has transformed into constant surveillance of deadlines, bills, and goals that never seem enough. This modern emptiness doesn't arise solely as a consequence of economic collapse. It also functions as fuel that keeps the machine running, as emotionally exhausted individuals rarely possess the energy to react, question, or seek alternatives. The growing nostalgia for simpler times, times when neighbors knew each other, families shared meals, and the future seemed less threatening, reveals how deep and structural this disconnection has become. And as this sense of emptiness expands, the question that begins to emerge with increasing intensity is not only about the present, but about a future that no longer inspires confidence. If the emotional void has already taken hold so deeply, what do the numbers that remain hidden in official statistics reveal? When emotional exhaustion combines with economic deterioration, a cold reading of the numbers reveals an even broader dimension of the problem, exposing what many institutions prefer to downplay in streamlined reports and speeches. Behind every story of stagnation are statistics showing how the middle class has been slowly squeezed between rising costs and incomes that no longer keep pace with reality. Debt, once justified as a tool for social mobility, now represents a set of invisible shackles that restrict the daily lives of millions of Americans. The credit card, which should serve as emergency support, has become a constant survival mechanism, and interest rates reach levels that increase the financial burden month after month, turning small purchases into prolonged commitments. Similarly, student debt, which for decades symbolized the obligatory passage to a stable career, has surpassed historical highs and compromises entire generations, preventing investments in housing, family, and even health. At the same time, the cost of rent, driven by corporate investments in the real estate sector, reaches values that consume more than half of many families' income, while silent inflation affects essential products, making each trip to the supermarket an exercise in sacrifice. These data, when analyzed together, reveal a country where the majority lives a few steps away from total instability, sustained only by the hope that the next month will be less burdensome than the current one. The situation becomes even more worrying when one observes the growing number of people resorting to food banks, welfare programs, and temporary jobs to compensate for the loss of purchasing power. Although such numbers are often presented as temporary indicators, their persistence demonstrates that the problem is structural, not circumstantial. Recent headlines point to successive records in indebtedness, personal bankruptcies, and delays in paying basic bills, painting a picture that contrasts sharply with the image of prosperity frequently displayed in official speeches. Given such compelling data, it becomes impossible to avoid the question that looms on the horizon. If the numbers already reveal such fragility, what does the final warning indicate when these signs are projected into the near future? When such significant numbers are projected for the coming years, a scenario emerges that surpasses any optimistic interpretation, revealing a horizon in which the American middle class gradually loses the capacity to sustain the role it has played for decades. Current trends indicate that the imbalance between income and cost of living tends to intensify, widening not only the economic gap, but also the social tension stemming from a feeling of collective powerlessness. As cases of default, personal bankruptcies, and dependence on welfare programs increase, a fragile situation arises that threatens the traditional pillars of society, compromising structures that once seemed unshakable, such as the real estate market, the education system, and even political stability in historically consolidated regions. This future scenario, far from being a theoretical exercise, is already manifesting itself in localities where the economic downturn has produced entire areas with abandoned properties, empty schools, and public services operating at their limit. Communities that once represented the heart of the middle class now live with the daily fear that any market fluctuation or new economic policy will be enough to destroy what little remains. This feeling of collective vulnerability fuels an environment of uncertainty that spreads silently, but which, at the same time, prepares the ground for ruptures that could redefine how American society functions at its core. Growing polarization, coupled with accumulated frustration, increases the risk of intense tensions, especially in regions that heavily depended on economic stability to maintain social cohesion. The feeling that the country is divided between those who accumulate more and more wealth and those who struggle to survive creates a climate of permanent distrust, in which the very concept of a secure future becomes a matter of doubt. In times of prolonged instability, history shows that societies tend to look for culprits, and this search can result in conflicts, institutional ruptures, or protest movements that profoundly transform the social order. Faced with such a compelling warning, the question arises that the public feels but rarely verbalizes. If tomorrow holds such profound risks, what is left to be said when we reach the point of confronting the ultimate truth, the one that can no longer be ignored? When the warning ceases to be a projection and becomes a fact, all that remains is to confront what has always been before everyone. The American middle class is not only weakening economically, it is losing the emotional and symbolic foundation that allowed it to sustain the country for so many generations. The sum of accumulated debt, frustrated expectations, emptied cities, and deteriorated social bonds has produced a kind of collective silence in which each individual perceives the fragility of the system, but few find the strength to question it. This silence, more than any statistic, reveals the depth of a collapse that occurs from within, far from the headlines, but present in every suffocating routine, every financial renunciation, and every persistent feeling that the future no longer holds the same promises. The uncomfortable truth is that these 5 invisible errors are not accidental flaws in an expanding model. They are carefully integrated gears, operating to keep a large part of the population in a continuous cycle of effort and exhaustion. The normalization of this cycle prevents many from realizing how much they have been conditioned to accept as inevitable a reality that should not be natural. The belief that simply working harder, saving more, or adapting more only deepens the trap, as it transfers to the individual the responsibility for an imbalance that is essentially structural. And as this logic perpetuates itself, the distance between those who accumulate power and those who struggle to survive widens in a way that redefines not only the economy, but also the identity of an entire society. The conclusion of this reflection doesn't emerge as absolute pessimism, but as a recognition that understanding these mechanisms is the first step towards breaking the cycle that exhausts and imprisons. A clear perception of the problem doesn't resolve the collapse, but it restores to the individual the awareness that has been slowly eroded by the weight of routine and the silent pressure of a system operating in the shadows. In the midst of this process, the question that remains is not only what will happen to the middle class, but what each person needs to see before the structure becomes irreversible. If this content helped you understand what nobody shows, sign up now to follow each new episode of this ongoing investigation into the silent collapse that is redefining America.